What's up, everybody? Welcome into a solo edition of SSPN. As you can see, I had a little inspiration for this video just after thinking about all the things that the Spurs have gone through to kind of get in the position that they are, to be in all these rumors and everything that we're seeing in the offseason, and also just, communicating with you guys over the years. And I kind of just wanted to give my breakdown on the Spurs rebuild. Now, obviously, you guys know if you watch this channel, I'll be honest, me and Ethan, we were kind of birthed into, the 22 seasons of going to the playoffs. And so, really, we never questioned Pop in the front office. And you've got 5 championships to go with that. But obviously, since that dreaded day back in 2017 when Zaza Pachulia put his foot under Kawhi Leonard, there have definitely been some struggles for the Spurs and some things that they've had to work through in order to get back to where they're at. So I just kind of wanted to give my perspective on that. And again, as you guys have known watching this channel, to be honest, in a lot of ways, I do kind of blindly follow Brian Wright, RC Buford, Greg Popovich. And that's not to say there's things here and there that you can criticize about them. I'm not trying to say that they're, if you question them, then, it's just completely wrong and all that. But I think there's a reason why, a lot of Spurs fans out there do have a lot of faith in Pop in the front office, if you will. As much as there's some criticism that we've been seeing too, from me and Ethan's perspective, there's a reason that we trust these guys. And it's not just because of, again, the 22 straight playoff seasons, the 5 championships, the multiple Hall of Famers that they've had on the team. It's because of other things that we've seen in the past couple years too. So we're going to go to our good old friend Wikipedia here as I pull up the Spurs here. I want to make this a little bit bigger if I can. Can I maximize this? Okay, now I'm off the screen. Alrighty. Well, let's go ahead and adjust this here. We'll go picture in picture on this one because I kind of want to make this the main talking point here today. So, with that being said, as you guys can see, these are kind of the seasons, the past, the last seasons, if you will, that the Spurs really had a ton of success, those plus 60 win seasons. And obviously, when we look at this 2016-2017 season, or excuse me, or yes, this 2016-2017 season, a big part of that is Zaza Pachulia putting his foot underneath Kawhi Leonard, and then everything that ensued after with Uncle Dennis, the rift in the relationship. I'm not here to rehash all that or really give my opinions on it, to be honest, because it is what it is at this point. But the bigger point that I'm trying to get here is that whole situation, in a sense, I don't want to say that Zaza necessarily caused it, but if Zaza never puts his foot underneath Kawhi Leonard, maybe there is still the rift in the relationship. But I think a lot of Spurs fans, and I think even some other people around the NBA that aren't Spurs fans, would say that 2017 playoffs, the Spurs might have been the best team out there. And there's a pretty good chance that they could have beat the Warriors and gone to the finals and then won the finals, naturally. Whoever was going to come out of the West that year, in my opinion, was going to win the finals. Now, you guys can disagree with me in the comments if you want. Obviously, I know there's a lot of Spurs fans here, so I feel like a lot of you guys will feel me on this one. But man, I mean, if we go back to that season, whether it's game one where Jonathan Simmons is hitting, a half court, and when I say game one, I mean literally game one of that season, where Jonathan Simmons is hitting a half court shot and the Spurs are up like almost 20 on the KD Warriors. The only team that year, and maybe there's a game here or there that I'm forgetting, but really it felt like the only team that was able to kind of, punch into that just, plethora of talent that the Warriors had that year with KD, Clay, Draymond, and Steph, as well as the rest of the guys on that roster at the time that kind of rounded out the depth. Again, the only team that really punctured them and kind of showed vulnerability, like we saw in game one of the Western Conference Finals that year, was the Spurs. It was Kawhi Leonard. It was Greg Popovich, being able to kind of puncture that Steve Kerr, dynasty. If there's anybody that knew Steve Kerr, it's Coach Popovich. But I could go on and on how the Spurs were, the few teams that were able to get big leads, or one of the few teams that were able to get big leads on that KD Warriors team. But the bigger point, again, is that, I think there's a pretty good chance the Spurs win the championship that year if Zaza doesn't put his foot under Kawhi. So if that happens, the Spurs have 6 championships. And I think that, that can change a lot of things when it comes to criticism for RC Buford or Greg Popovich, et cetera, et cetera. And even if let's just say in a totally hypothetical world, right? The Spurs win that championship, and there's still the rift with Kawhi. At that point, you know what I mean? I feel like people are going to be more sympathetic to the Spurs if that was the case. You know what I mean? Because it's obvious that they could win. And obviously, you want to keep your star players happy. But it's not like the Spurs don't have a track record of doing that. Like the only person who's really done that, again, y'all can correct me in the comments, from my knowledge, is Kawhi Leonard. I guess you could point to the DeJounte thing a little bit, but even then, it's like DeJounte's showing up to Pop's retirement. I don't really think that it was the same level as much as he made some social media comments. And again, like, if we're just talking player by player, all respect to DeJounte, him and Kawhi, those are just two different tiers of guys as well. But I don't want to get too deep in the weeds on that. So let me move on from the 2017 playoffs into 2017, 2018. So obviously, this was the dreaded season where everything was just about, where is Kawhi Leonard? Is he going to play? It seems like he's going to play, and then he never came back. Eventually, we got the comments from Tony Parker, and I kind of feel like, obviously hindsight is 2020, but when that happened, that was probably the nail in the coffin, in a sense, for the Spurs relationship. Again, I'm sure there's a lot of you guys out there who are maybe more in the weeds on that. So give me any details. But again, the Uncle Dennis rift, if you want to call it that, the Kawhi rift. He never plays in 2018, but still, despite that, the Spurs have a winning record. They almost get to 50 wins without Kawhi. And yes, they lose to the Warriors again, but I don't. I'm pretty sure the Warriors went to the finals again in 2018, if I'm remembering correctly. Let's go ahead and this is the Spurs. Gosh dang it! I was trying to just find the season in general. Here we go. Yeah, they won the championship this year. Okay, I wasn't going crazy there. I thought I was for a second, but yeah. So you lose to basically both of those years. You lose to the Warriors. You lose to the eventual champions in both of those years, unless one of those years was the year that LeBron was able to beat him. That might have been this year. I can't remember. Again, here, let me just go ahead and look that up. Nope, they won. This was their back-to-back years. So you lost to the Warriors twice. Like, I'm not, I'm sorry they lost to the eventual champions. You know what I mean? So the fact that they even got a game off them without Kawhi is kind of impressive to me. Now, again, if you want to criticize maybe, the way that the relationship was handled with Kawhi, sure, I'll get that. But again, I feel like a lot of Spurs fans were more like, there's a lot of things out of the Spurs' control with that situation. And again, if we go back to the Spurs' track record historically with, all-star level players, really Kawhi is the only one who's done something like that. And obviously, as well, the elephant in the room, we've seen what's happened with Kawhi, since then. And that's not even me hating on Kawhi when I say that. I'm just saying that no matter what team he's played on, other than really the next year with Toronto when he won the championship, he hasn't played consistently, and it's been that same knee thing. So that was a Kawhi thing. That wasn't a Spurs thing, in my opinion. And again, that's probably old news for you guys. I probably should have said that like 7 minutes ago in this video, but I think you guys get the point here. So obviously, after that happens, the Spurs make a trade for Kawhi. After that whole season, they trade for DeMar DeRozan, and that's when the Spurs go 48-34 in the next season. They go 7 games with the Nuggets in kind of Jokic's first like breakout series. Obviously, we all remember the Derek White game where he went for 36 and dunked on Paul Millsap, but that was a hard-fought series. And again, no shame in losing to the Nuggets. Yes, it wasn't to the eventual NBA champions, but it's not like that was a slouch Nuggets team either. And again, that was kind of the beginning of Jokic's ascension into becoming the championship MVP level player that he is today. So again, all things considered, like getting almost to 50 wins, and okay, yes, let me see here. Were they the second seed? And that's pretty crazy. So you're losing to the 7th seed. So I understand the frustration there. No. They're second in the Southwest. Let me chill. That's what I was gonna say. I was like 48-34 doesn't sound like second in the West. My bad. Misinterpreted that here. I believe actually the Nuggets were the 2 seed and the Spurs were the 7th seed. Let me just go ahead and confirm that. Yes, second in the Southwest, 7th in the West overall. So again, you're the 7th seed and you take the Nuggets to 7 games. Like, I'm not mad at that. And I think that right there is kind of when the Spurs may have realized their ceiling a little bit. You could say that they ran it back in 2019, 2020, and the record wasn't as great, but like COVID happened. Again, I'll admit that there was a little decline there if you want to go off the record, but they didn't play a full season. You never know. Maybe at the end of the year, they could have strung some wins together and been close to 500. Regardless, I'll admit, like, that's a decline. But do the Spurs address that? Yes, they do. Or, excuse me, well, they have to go through COVID first, right? And then the next season, which is also shortened due to COVID, they try it one more time. Okay, hey, we'll give it the COVID mulligan. We played well in the bubble. We saw some flashes. Let's see if we can make this thing work. And then again, you kind of get the same record. So they realize it, for sure. Also, I want to mention, I feel like around this time is when, and it may have even been before this, they had their eyes on Victor, because you got to remember that Boris Diaw was the head, I believe, or at least in a very high up position for Metropolitans 92. And before that, he played for Tony Parker's team in France. I'm forgetting the exact name. It's been a couple years since we've gone over all that. But regardless, the point is he's involved with Boris Diaw and Tony Parker, and they're hearing about him, and you're seeing these videos float around with him and Rudy Gobert when he's 16. So I think the Spurs kind of had that in the back of their mind the whole time. There's obviously the picture of him in the Tony Parker jersey when he's a little kid. And again, this is kind of tinfoil hatty. I don't know. I have no sources. This is total speculation on my part, but I feel like behind the scenes, the Spurs were kind of eyeing Victor, for years ahead and setting themselves up. So after you try the DeMar thing, for one more year with DeJounte, Derek, all those guys, right? After the promising season you had pre-COVID, when you kind of have the same result here in 2021, they trade DeMar DeRozan that offseason. And then the next season, obviously kind of, I would say kind of in the same vein, you could argue that maybe the win percentage would have been a little bit higher, but you still have DeJounte and Derek on that team. So, you're not going complete tank yet. Now, I will say, what did the Spurs do at the trade deadline this year? They trade Derek White to Boston, and then in the offseason, they trade DeJounte Murray to the Atlanta Hawks, which, thank you, Brian Wright and the Spurs, because of that trade, we have the 14th pick this year, which can now help build around Wemby because of that asset from the DeJounte trade. So after all that, they go full tank here in 2022, 2023. It's like they set it up. It's like they almost planned it out, timely with each of these moves to try to get back the assets that they liked the most. And, to kind of just like wean off of what they did instead of doing it all at once, because they could have done that. And, maybe they win the Cade Cunningham sweepstakes or something like that. I can't remember the exact number one picks for all of these years off the top of my head, but I think everybody would rather kind of wait until the Victor Wembanyama lottery and really try to go all in on that one. And that kind of ties into some other NBA conspiracy theories if the NBA was setting the Spurs up for that. But that's a whole nother can of worms that I won't get into. But the bigger point is they set up the tank for the Victor year. Like, even if they weren't planning it, in around COVID or in 2021, like I suggested earlier, at the least they traded DeMar in the summer of 2021. Then 6 months later, they traded Derek. And then another 6 months later after that, they traded DeJounte. Those are like your three best players on the team. LaMarcus Aldridge also exits during that time. And you really have the roster set up to tank for Victor. And that's exactly what they did. And that's exactly what happened. Now, obviously, the next season, the record stays the same. I can see people's frustrations with Victor Wembanyama on the team. But again, it's his rookie season. And look at the roster around him. I don't mean that in a disrespectful way. It's just a lot of those guys were still very, very young. It was not a team set up to win or make a playoff push. And in a sense, without that 22-60 season, the Spurs aren't in the position to draft Stephon Castle, who, a lot of Spurs fans have fell in love with. And I think if Spurs fans could go back in time, they would do the same thing with what we saw from Stephon Castle this year. And of course, him winning Rookie of the Year again, to kind of prove that. So again, not trying to just say everything with Spurs-colored glasses, but leading into this season, I'm not really mad at anything the Spurs did. Like, it was going to take some time, especially with Victor, and I don't want to just win immediately because then we're not able to add the talent that can be on Victor's timeline long-term, like a Stephon Castle and a potential Dylan Harper this season. So that brings us to this year, right? Obviously a 12-game increase in wins. And most of those came early in the year, pre-Victor injury and also pre-De'Aaron Fox shutdown. But the bigger thing for me, CP3 and Harrison Barnes, with just those additions before the De'Aaron Fox trade, right? The Spurs beat their win record from the past 2 seasons. They eclipsed 23 wins in January of this season. Now, I'm not saying that's perfect, but I do think that's a significant improvement. And if we go ahead and go over to the standings here in the West, let me go ahead and readjust this here. Apologies for that. Let me go ahead and get the right screen shared here. If we go over to the standings for this season, I think, okay, I'm not going to go crazy here. The Spurs aren't catching the Grizzlies or the Warriors. They're not catching anybody 1 through 8. But 9, 10, 11, 12, I mean, the Suns and the Trailblazers only had 2 more wins. Here's my thing, and the biggest point I'm getting to. I don't think it's crazy to say that if the Spurs have both of their All-Stars on their roster in De'Aaron Fox and Victor Wembanyama for the end of the year, they win like 5 to 8 more games. Let's be real conservative here. Not anything crazy. We understand the West is a gauntlet, but let's just say 5 to 8 more games with Wemby on the floor and De'Aaron Fox. I really don't think that's that crazy. 5 to 8 more games is in the play-in. I mean, maybe if you go with that 5, and you're tied with the Mavericks and they win, the coin flip, okay, whatever. But still, you had the same record as the Mavs at that point. You know what I mean? It was because of a tiebreaker, you know. But even then, I think they could surpass the Mavs, especially with the move that they've made at the trade deadline. So the bottom line is, I think if the Spurs were healthy, they're in the play-in, or they're at least much closer to being in the play-in. And with that being said, that just really makes me view this season, not necessarily in a bad light. It makes me think about what Mitch Johnson said as I pull up the records here one more time. In his presser, when somebody said in this rough season or this down season, I forget exactly the verbiage that the reporter used, but, he replied and he said in this quote unquote down season or tough year, basically implying that that's what you said. It's a quote unquote, you're saying that. We're not viewing it that way. Because again, the Spurs eclipsed their win total from January, or in January, from the past 2 seasons before they even got De'Aaron Fox, right? They still improved by 12 wins, despite Victor Wembanyama not playing after the trade deadline and De'Aaron Fox not playing for the majority of the time after the trade deadline. And, say what you want about Jeremy Sohan, but that's when you talk about the Spurs front court being one of its weaknesses and him just being like a consistent rotation player, I think that has an impact as well. So you have 2 All-Stars and 3 rotation players in total, like guys who are getting significant minutes for this team. 2 of those guys being in the front court, which is already your biggest weakness. I expect them to lose more games, at the end of the year when Victor Wembanyama gets deep vein thrombosis, which again, out of the Spurs' control. I mean, if you want to go on some rabbit hole about, the Spurs medical staff, but I that's not me. And I don't think that's true either. I guess you can have some concerns about Wemby's health long term. And I know that's something we talked about of him coming into the draft, but all signs point that he's going to be fine. We've seen some other guys get it and come back, like Damian Lillard. Obviously, he had the Achilles tear after, so prayers to him with that. But it's not like we didn't have other examples of this and people coming back. I think the Spurs were using an abundance of caution and also a little bit of, an under the table tank as well, if you will, to try to get the best draft odds possible, which led to the second overall pick and, potentially another all-star player or trading that pick for an all-star player now. Let me rephrase that. A potential all-star player long-term in Dylan Harper or somebody that they can bring in now if they want to move that trade, just to clarify what I said there. So again, after all of that this year, everything that happened, if the Spurs are fully healthy this year, I think they make the play-in or at least get to the 11th seed, and then they lose a tiebreaker with the Mavs. And again, it's like you still have the record to get in the play-in. You're just in the West. Like, if you're in the East, it's a completely different discussion, even with the injuries. We talked about this with Chris from Spurs Spotlight. Shout out to him. if the Spurs are in the East this year, there could be a chance that they could make the play-in this season, even with Wemby and Fox out for the year, and Jeremy Sohan sat for the last couple games of the year as well. So, in my opinion, you have your first year with Victor, right? You kind of have the same thing that happened with the 22 and 60 year, but that was important to get Stephon Castle and kind of add, the next potential rookie of the year, just like Tim Duncan and David Robinson. I know that's a little bit different circumstances, but still, you're adding two straight rookies of the year. You can't be mad at that, at least in my opinion. And then on top of that, again, the injuries happened. So I'm not really mad at this season, is the point. And again, in a fully healthy year, they make the play in. And then I think we're just viewing this completely differently. We're thinking about, okay, 22 and 60 to literally being in the playoffs. Like that's a very good jump for the Spurs to make in Wemby's year too. So with all of that being said, my evaluation of the Spurs rebuild is they're right on track. Yeah, there were some rough years in the DeMar situation, but again, that kind of all stems back to Kawhi. And I think they did a good job of leading up to, making the right trades and the right decisions at the right times to lead into tanking for Victor. And then, gave him a year to learn the NBA, kind of adjust to the speed of everything, with his unique body type, as well as playing in the French league for most of his life. And then that also allows you to bring in another rookie of the year. And then this season, you had some unfortunate injuries, but you bring in an all-star point guard in De'Aaron Fox. Now, here's what I'll say. As much as I can say this is all sunshine and rainbows, and I'm very happy, with what I've seen from the Spurs and the Spurs rebuild as of right now. If next season the Spurs record, everybody's healthy and the Spurs record is 34 and 48 again, or like sub 40 wins, or they're not in the play-in, like I will 100% come out and be like, that's not, I think that's below the standard that even the Spurs would set for themselves. But the context and the circumstances of this season, personally, I'm not really mad at it. And again, not to repeat myself or talk in circles too much, but if we go back to Mitch Johnson and that quote at the press conference, I think there's a lot of people out there that are viewing this season, in a rough way because of the way that it ended. But in reality, I don't think the Spurs are viewing it that way. And when you take into account the injuries, again, what else was like this Spurs roster going to do kind of post All-Star break? And that may have been for the greater good when it comes to drafting Dylan Harper and moving up to the second pick in the lottery as well. So I'll get off my soapbox with that one right there. But that's kind of my thoughts on every year post Zaza, if you will, or post, Kawhi's exit from the Spurs and how they've kind of done everything and taken the steps to try to get back, into this space where now the Spurs are in every rumor. Everybody wants to hear about what's going to happen with Wemby. Stephon Castle, he definitely kind of raised his star at the Rising Stars Challenge as well as the dunk contest. He's a name known around the league. Of course, he won Rookie of the Year, so that's going to add to kind of his prestige as well. So you bring in both of these guys, through tanking. And then this season, if you're fully healthy, I really don't think it's unreasonable to say that the Spurs would be in the play-in. And so I think if the Spurs were in the play-in in year 2 of Wemby, people would just be viewing things a lot differently and feeling different. Obviously, there's always going to be people out there, who may just find something to criticize. But at the same time, I think you got to give credit where credit's due. I think the Spurs have been slowly building this up. I think they've been making the right decisions. And yeah, they had to pivot a little bit when they got thrown, kind of a dart out of nowhere with Wemby getting deep vein thrombosis. But what did they do then? They let De'Aaron play a little bit longer. Then, okay, let's get his surgery going. And through all this, we'll increase our draft odds, kind of at the last minute post All-Star break. So I'm not mad at anything that the Spurs have done in their rebuild. I'm not saying there's not things to criticize. Please tell me in the comments, what I mean, your thoughts or things that you didn't like or, decisions that the Spurs made that maybe you disagree with. But I think overall, that they've built this thing up pretty well for Wemby and they've acquired assets in years past that now the Spurs can use, to help build around him. Again, this is kind of a put up or shut up year. Like if there's a major drop off or the Spurs are still sub 40 wins and they don't take, another next step, because I consider this year them taking a step. There were just some things that kind of derailed it that were out of their control, like Victor Wembanyama not being able to play. Um, so if they don't take that next step next year, yeah, 100% criticize them. Like, I'm not mad at that. But I don't think that it was just a disaster this year or anything like that. I don't think that Brian Wright and Greg Popovich and RC Buford, don't know what they're doing or have lost their way, since the 22 straight playoff seasons or anything like that. I think it's just been kind of cool, calculated, a little bit behind the scenes. And again, like I said, all kind of, in the background, in that, you know, not loud Spurs fashion. They're doing loud things in quiet ways. I guess that's the way that I'll describe it. And that's kind of what you could say about the Spurs dynasty back in the day. Didn't always get the hype, didn't always get the most ESPN hits, but they were the best team in the league, the years that they won the championship. So doing loud things quietly, if you will. That's how I'll describe this Spurs rebuild. I have a lot of faith in it. I know, again, I was kind of born in to the 22 winning season, so there's a little bit of bias in that, and maybe long term I'll be proven wrong, and the Spurs will fumble this whole thing, and I'll have to come here and be like, man, there were some things I didn't see, and I just blindly trusted them too much. But when it comes to their track record, I got all the faith in the world in the Spurs front office, and here's the last thing I'll leave you guys with. I don't feel this way about all my favorite teams. I do not. I only feel this way about the Spurs. I'm a Saints fan. I'm not going to get into that because this isn't a Saints podcast, but I'm not very happy with their front office and their management and their ownership. I think there's tons of things to criticize about that. But again, when I compare them to the Spurs, it's like two different planets. One has a track record of success and one has, one championship kind of thanks to a coach and a quarterback in Drew Brees and Sean Payton. Another thing I could say, my favorite college football team, the LSU Tigers. I think it's a big year for Brian Kelly this year. If he doesn't take a step and LSU doesn't make the playoffs, I think he's underperforming in year 4. The reasons I bring up these football examples is because, again, I just want to show you guys that it's not like with all my sports, I'm like, oh, these guys are just the greatest thing ever. You know what I mean? And I'm not going to look at it with a critical eye. But when it comes to the Spurs, I think the track record speaks for themselves. And I'll leave it at that. Appreciate you guys. Tell me what you guys think in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit like and subscribe below. If you want to stay updated with the channel, follow us on X or Twitter, whatever you want to call it, at SSPN on YT, at Jude McLaren, and at Ethan_Quintero. We appreciate you guys. We'll catch you on the next one. Go Spurs, go.